In a thunderous congressional battle, Jasmine Crockett storms into the chamber to confront Ted Cruz, not just over immigration, but over the buried lies that built his name. As Cruz demands tighter borders and labels others as threats, Crockett unleashes a devastating truth tied to his own bloodline. The air turns electric. Her words don't just cut, they expose a system built to forget. So, is this the moment Ted Cruz finally falls? Or will the system rise again to crush the woman who dared to speak his truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the glaring lights of the Capitol hearing room, tension crackled like static. It was the opening session of a live, nationally televised hearing on immigration policy, one that would define the next election cycle. Ted Cruz was already seated, his suit perfectly pressed, eyes locked on the camera. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and cold. America cannot be the home of everyone. A border that's open is a country that's dying. His words hung in the air, deliberate and final, as if daring anyone to challenge them. Senators around him nodded. Staffers scribbled. Viewers at home clutched their remotes. But suddenly, all movement paused. The doors at the back of the chamber creaked open. Jasmine Crockett entered, 10 minutes late, with no apology, no hesitation. Her heels struck the marble like gunshots. In her left hand, she carried a thick gray file folder. In her right, a sealed manila envelope bulging with documents. Her face was unreadable, focused, but her arrival sent a visible wave across the room. Cruz narrowed his eyes. "Nice of you to join us, Congresswoman," he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "I suppose border security can wait for cable news theatrics." The remark drew a few smug laughs from his bench. Crockett didn't respond. She sat down slowly, placed the envelope flat on the table, and slid the folder beside it with precision. Then, without looking up, she whispered loud enough for every microphone to catch, "No, Senator. What can't wait is the truth you've been running from." The room held its breath, waiting to see what Jasmine Crockett would do next. Ted Cruz leaned forward, like a man too smug to sense a storm coming. His chair creaked slightly as he adjusted his posture, elbows resting on polished wood, fingertips pressed together like a sermonizer ready to deliver judgment. He didn't look at Crockett. He looked past her, through her, like a distraction not worth real attention. But his voice cut through the stillness, sharp and rehearsed. "If someone's late because they got stuck at the border," he said, pausing to let the words marinate in their cruelty, "we should probably clarify. We're here to keep America safe." There it was, the line, not just a jab at punctuality, but a dog whistle wrapped in policy, suggesting that even lateness could be suspect when it came from someone like her. Laughter broke out from the right side of the chamber, not raucous, but smug, low, and practiced. A few Republican senators exchanged glances like poker players trading silent tells. One leaned back, arms crossed, grinning as if the game was already won. Another shook his head with mock pity, as though Crockett were a student outmatched by her professor. The insult had landed exactly as Cruz intended, and for a split second, it seemed no one would challenge it. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or raise her voice. Instead, she slowly leaned toward the microphone, her fingers calm, her voice clear, a voice not raised, but sharpened. Her words didn't try to match his volume. They didn't need to. "I was late," she said, letting the silence hold between syllables, "because I was speaking with a child who'd been separated from her mother 20 meters from this very room in a detention center your office has defended." There were no metaphors, no rhetoric, just truth laid bare. A few aides froze mid-typing. The oxygen shifted in the room. The temperature dropped by degrees. That kind of calm only comes from someone carrying something heavier than shame, someone who's already walked through fire. Ted Cruz, for the first time that day, didn't have a line ready. His eyes narrowed, jaw stiffened, his mask of confidence cracked just slightly, enough for the cameras to catch it. No one laughed now, because the room suddenly remembered this wasn't just politics. It was about a little girl and the woman who refused to forget her. The silence was still hanging when Jasmine Crockett reached into her gray folder and slowly pulled out a stack of official papers, pages stamped clearly with ProPublica, 2019. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She let the weight of what she held speak first. Then she looked directly at the panel and said, calm but commanding, let's talk about what happens 20 meters from here. Her tone was steady, but the words came like slow, controlled fire. Let's talk about the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, where over 5,400 children were separated from their parents under your administration's zero-tolerance policy. She lifted one page toward the light, rows of names, dates, and intake codes visible. Her fingers moved across the paper like she knew the stories by heart. Thousands of children, Senator, infants, toddlers, held in cages. Documented, verified, erased. The word erased landed with force. The hearing room, once loud with reaction, now sat frozen in heavy quiet. Even the camera zoom was slower than usual, cautious. Crockett wasn't reading statistics. She was building a case. And what's worse, she continued, now making eye contact with Cruz, those facilities are run by private companies who donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to your campaign and your PACs. That's not coincidence. That's complicity. Ted Cruz pressed the mic button with the flair of a man who had done it 1,000 times. His voice was colder now, his posture stiffer. I don't run those centers, he said carefully, the words rehearsed but dripping with disdain. I defend the law. His eyes narrowed. The next line came like a slap, meant to humiliate, not argue. And frankly, Congresswoman, a second-rate cable news model with fading ratings shouldn't be lecturing anyone on federal policy. Laughter rippled from the right side of the chamber, quiet but cruel. A few heads nodded. One aide bit his lip, fighting a grin. Cruz was smiling now, pleased with the wound, but then he twisted the knife. She's using children as props. It's theater, not testimony. He turned away like it was settled. Crockett didn't move. She didn't twitch. Her hand stayed folded over the folder, her shoulders still, her eyes locked on Cruz. But her voice came like truth pressed through stone. When the law starts turning profits for your donors, she said evenly, you stop being a lawmaker. You become a shareholder. That sentence broke the moment wide open. The cameras turned. Cruz blinked hard but said nothing. And then Crockett delivered the final line, not shouted, not dramatic, delivered with a clarity that left no room to breathe. And for the record, I don't laugh when children are locked behind barbed wire. The blow had landed, and the air in the hearing room thickened, dense with something heavier than silence. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to pause. She came with unfinished business. Her fingers moved deliberately now, not searching, but retrieving. From the folder beside her, she slid out a single sheet inside a protective sleeve, aged off-white, bearing the creases of history. She held it carefully, almost reverently, and as she raised it into the light, the words at the top became visible, Immigration and Naturalization Service, United States, 1957. The camera zoomed. Law clerks leaned in. Even Cruz's own aides shifted. Crockett placed the page flat on the table in front of her, smoothing it with one hand, then looked up, not at the audience, not at the cameras, but directly at Cruz. Her voice was quiet now, but tight with focus, like a thread pulled taut. Since we're talking about the law, Senator, she said, I'd like to read from this document, dated July 27, 1957. She paused just long enough for the room to listen with both ears and both eyes. Filed with the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, she read slowly, like she was placing each brick in a monument he thought she'd never touch. Rafael Benito Cruz Diaz, citizen of Cuba, files request for entry under grounds of political asylum following the Batista Revolution. The effect was immediate and visceral. Ted Cruz jerked slightly forward in his chair, as if jolted awake by a name he didn't expect to hear aloud. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. He hit his microphone button hard enough that it clicked twice. His voice was no longer smooth and controlled, it was tight, defensive, almost trembling with offense. "My father came here legally," he snapped, as if the courtroom had accused him of treason. He was not some illegal border crosser. He didn't sneak into this country. The words fell out fast, almost too fast, like they were being thrown to build a wall before anyone could look deeper. His shoulders stiffened. The smirk was gone. No more camera-ready quips, just raw correction, as if the paper in Crockett's hand was a live wire. But she didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She leaned in steadily, calmly, like someone who's already seen the ending, and said, he was allowed to stay because there was no wall, no ICE, no label calling him a criminal invader. She paused, not for drama, but for clarity, letting the hypocrisy sit in front of the nation. He was seen as a man in need. Today, he'd be seen as a threat. No one said a word. The document still lay between them, a father's request, a country's mercy, and a son who now built walls around the very path his father once walked. The room was already silent, but now it grew grave. Crockett didn't move quickly. She didn't need to. Her calm had become more terrifying than a raised voice. She reached into her folder once more, her movements deliberate, precise, like drawing a blade. What she held wasn't paper this time. It was a laminated photo, slightly curled at the corners, smudged from fingerprints that had held it too tightly for too long. She turned it gently toward the audience, toward the cameras, toward Cruz, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she pressed a small button built into her station, and suddenly every screen across the hearing room flickered to life. The chamber filled with a single image, impossible to look away from, a little girl, no older than 7, with large dark eyes, cheeks sunken by the desert sun, sitting awkwardly in a DHS processing chair nearly twice her size. She wore a bright pink jacket. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She looked like she was trying to disappear. "This," Crockett finally said, her voice cutting through the quiet like the edge of a knife, "is Jacqueline Cale." Her tone was not performative, it was personal, as if she had carried this name in her bones. She was 7 years old. She came here from Guatemala with her father. She didn't come with weapons. She didn't come to sell drugs. She came holding his hand, hoping for water. Her eyes swept the room as she spoke, her gaze a dare to anyone who thought they could turn away. And she died in U.S. government custody in December 2018, just hours after being processed by ICE. One staffer near the back dropped his pen. No one moved to pick it up. On every screen, Jacqueline's face stared back, frozen in time, a silent indictment of everything this hearing pretended to debate. Crockett's hand hovered near the photograph but didn't touch it again. Her voice was steady, but heavier now, soaked in memory and fury. "She died of dehydration, exhaustion, neglect," she said. "But more than anything, she died because we saw her as a burden, not a child." The room had no air left. Reporters in the back typed slower. The energy had shifted, not toward policy, but toward reckoning. And then Crockett did something that forced even the most disengaged to lift their eyes. She turned fully to Senator Cruz. She looked directly at him, not with anger, but with something deeper, disbelief, maybe, or sorrow. "If you had been a senator in 1957, she asked, each word heavy with intent, "would you have given your father the chance to live like Jacqueline begged for?" Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need volume. The weight of the question did all the damage. The timeline snapped into place: Cruz's father, Rafael, fleeing Cuba as a young man, Jacqueline, dying on American soil as a child. One was allowed to stay. The other wasn't allowed to survive. The contrast was brutal, personal, inescapable. Cruz shifted in his seat, his spine straightened, but it wasn't confidence, it was defense. His jaw locked, his fingers pressed together, not in thought, but in restraint. He didn't meet her eyes. "Don't weaponize emotion to obscure law," he said. The sentence was flat, lifeless, like he'd pulled it from a drawer where he kept lines to recite when facts became too inconvenient. It wasn't an answer. It was an escape hatch. But Crockett didn't let him crawl through it. Her voice returned, this time with a silence built inside it, a deep, quiet fury sharpened by restraint. "Policy doesn't die, Senator," she said, not loud, but devastating. "But children do." That was it. Nothing more. And yet it landed like a gavel slammed in the center of the Constitution itself. The image of Jacqueline was still glowing on every screen, her little face unblinking, unresisted, unmistakable. Around her were the digital echoes of every system that failed her: forms, barcodes, timestamps, ICE logos, chain-link fences. Behind Crockett, no one dared shift in their seats. Even those who disagreed with her politically didn't interrupt, because this was not a debate. It was a confrontation with a truth that had a name, a face, and a grave. And sitting across from that truth was a man whose own father had once been a boy from Cuba, standing at a border, begging for entry into a land of freedom. The difference was, no one called him illegal. The screens faded to black, but the weight of Jacqueline's face still hung in the room like smoke from a fire no one could put out. Crockett didn't pause to catch her breath. She pivoted cleanly, seamlessly, like someone who knew the next cut would go deeper than the last. Her hand moved again toward the console, fingers slow but precise, as though she were loading evidence into a courtroom. "Let's continue," she said, her voice even, bold, honed like the edge of a scalpel. "Because while you claim not to weaponize emotion, Senator, I'd like to address how you weaponize contradiction." Her thumb pressed the screen, and the monitors lit up again, not with the face of a child this time, but with the face of Ted Cruz himself, cast in sharp high definition under a podium floodlight. A timestamp appeared in the corner, October 2021. The footage was damning, not because it was hidden, but because it had been public all along. Cruz stood before a sea of American flags, his hands slicing the air with practiced certainty. "Illegal immigration is a threat to the very survival of this nation," he declared, face stern, voice booming as though reading from scripture. The audience behind him, a wall of red hats and folded arms, cheered. The video paused on that frame, Cruz mid-sentence, finger pointing as if accusing the camera itself. Then, without a sound cue or transition, a second clip replaced it. The year changed. The backdrop changed. But the man at the microphone didn't. This was March 2015, and Cruz was standing in Miami, flanked by Cuban-American elders and exiles, faces lined with struggle. "We must welcome Cuban refugees," he said warmly. "They are escaping tyranny. We have a moral obligation to let them in." His voice was softer, even proud. The crowd applauded. Some rose to their feet. He smiled. He clapped along. The screen cut to black again. Crockett didn't move right away. She let the room sit in that silence, heavy and damning. Then she turned slowly, deliberately, back to Cruz. Her face was calm. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't need to yell. Her words carried the weight of exposure. "You said that Cuban refugees must be welcomed. You called them victims of tyranny." She let the sentence hang for just a beat, long enough for it to breathe, long enough for everyone in the room to sit in the discomfort. Then she straightened in her chair and fired the question without flinching. "Why is it that white immigrants from Cuba are called political refugees, but brown immigrants from Guatemala are called invaders?" The blow didn't come with volume. It came with precision. No one spoke. No one blinked. Even the buzzing of fluorescent lights above seemed to fade. On the panel, one senator shifted slightly in his chair but didn't dare look up. An aide froze mid-scroll on her phone. Across the gallery, reporters stopped typing, not because the story had ended, but because this moment wrote itself. Cruz sat rigid, unmoving. His hands were clasped tightly now, knuckles blanched white, eyes locked somewhere just over Crockett's shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for the mic, because the question wasn't just aimed at him. It was aimed at an entire system that knew the answer and refused to say it aloud. Crockett didn't press further. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. The silence from her last blow was still echoing off the chamber walls, but Crockett didn't let it breathe. She reached into her folder one final time, retrieving something not visual, not emotional, but clinical, a piece of paper, a memo, a weapon made entirely of text. She held it between two fingers like a lit match. No photos, no faces, just the black and white mechanics of power exposed. Her thumb clicked the touchscreen beside her, and the monitors behind them flickered back to life, this time showing not a child, not a face, but a confidential internal campaign email dated March 2018. The subject line read, "Messaging Strategy, Southern Base." There was no music, no headline, just language, cold, precise, and brutal. The text lit up in yellow, push harder on words like illegal, violent, disease when referring to undocumented migrants. Fear increases urgency. Urgency increases fundraising across southern states. Gasps weren't loud, but they were real, sharp inhales, glances exchanged, the kind of reaction that says, "We weren't supposed to see this." Crockett didn't speak right away. She let the words hang, let the audience read every line for themselves, every word designed not for truth, but for transaction, not policy, but profit. Then she said, calm and controlled, "Since we're speaking of language and labels, let's talk about what gets said when no one's supposed to hear it." No emotion, just indictment. The memo remained on screen, burning into the eyes of every person in that room. Cruz snapped to life, his face already stiff, twisted into something tighter, less defense, more offense. He slammed his index finger on the mic, and the click echoed. "That document is fake," he snapped, each syllable like a bullet ricocheting off marble. "It's fabricated. I've never authorized anything like that." His voice was rising, but it wasn't strength, it was urgency, like a man trying to outrun something already behind him. His jaw locked, his eyes scanned the panel, looking for someone, anyone, to back him up, but no one moved. Crockett didn't blink. Her eyes didn't even shift. She stayed fixed on Cruz, like a prosecutor reading a verdict she already knew by heart. Her next words were colder than ice. "The FBI confirmed this document during a 2021 investigation. March. You remember the month, don't you?" The way she said it wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. The room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. The screen still glowed behind her, the highlighted language staring down every senator in the room, illegal, violent, disease. It wasn't just strategy. It was intent. And she had laid it bare without shouting, without breaking, just letting the truth sit there, visible, ugly, undeniable. The echo of the memo still lingered, but Jasmine Crockett didn't give the room time to recover. She leaned forward, her voice quiet now, not because she lacked force, but because what she was about to say didn't need to be shouted. It needed to be heard. The silence deepened, charged with something raw and unfinished. "Let me tell you a story," she said, her eyes fixed not on Cruz, but on something beyond him, something deeper than his deflection. "A little girl from El Salvador, 9 years old." Her words were gentle, but each syllable landed like the slow tightening of a noose. She couldn't speak English, couldn't write her name. The only word she knew in this country, she paused just briefly, was "Mama." The word dropped like a stone. They took her at the border, put her in a cage alone. 76 days. The air felt heavier. Crockett's tone didn't waver. By the time she got out, she had stopped speaking altogether. She didn't answer questions. She didn't cry. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Her jaw set, voice sharpened. "I call it what it is, state-sponsored cruelty." Then, with a movement so deliberate it felt ritualistic, Crockett reached under her folder and pulled out a narrow, weathered plastic wristband. It was small, stained, faded. She held it up between two fingers, slow and steady, and the camera zoomed in as if drawn to it. There were no names, no birthdays, just a number, 721-0885. She didn't speak for a moment. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what it meant to be reduced to digits. Finally, she said, this is what she wore for 76 days. This was her identity. Her eyes turned now, slowly and precisely, locking on Cruz. In the eyes of your system, she didn't have a name. She didn't have a history. She was disposable. And then Crockett leaned forward, not with anger, but with quiet, calculated force, and delivered the line that shattered the illusion of policy as neutrality. "But your father," she said, her voice now colder than before, "when he arrived in Houston, he came with a Cuban crest stamped in blue ink across his immigration form." The contrast was total, a child stripped of her name, her voice, her humanity, and a man welcomed with an emblem. The weight of it was undeniable. Across the bench, Ted Cruz looked down, his gaze falling hard onto the table, as if the grain in the wood might somehow rescue him. His hands, once animated, now locked into fists, tense, pale, unmoving. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his eyes, because there, in front of the world, the mirror had been held up, and he didn't like the man staring back. The wristband rested on the table like a silent indictment, but the room was no longer reacting. It was absorbing. The air itself felt arrested, no movement, no side chatter, just a chamber suspended in moral freefall. Jasmine Crockett didn't need applause. She didn't even need a witness. What she had was time, truth, and the unbearable weight of history pressing down on one man. Her gaze never left Ted Cruz, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had shrunk to just the space between them. The truth had taken shape now, not in legal documents or photos, but in something far more unshakable, legacy. When Crockett, without blinking, raised it like a mirror he could no longer look away from, her voice came soft, almost quiet, but every syllable was weighted like lead dropped into glass. "If your father crossed the Texas border today," she said, letting the words drip like acid onto polished marble, "you would put him in a cage and call him an invader." The sentence didn't just land. It settled deep in the bones of the room. No one spoke. The sound was gone from the space, but the tension roared louder than any voice could. Crockett's tone didn't rise. She didn't lean forward. She didn't need theatrics. She simply let the truth hang there, right above Cruz's head, waiting to crash. She let a breath pass, just one, but even that pause felt unbearable, like it was holding the weight of a generation. Then, without blinking, she added the final blow, not with anger, but with precision. "You are building a wall to stop your own father if he had arrived 60 years too late." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't plead. It condemned, not with hatred, but with clarity, not with vengeance, but with justice. The power of it wasn't just in what she said. It was in what she refused to let be forgotten. Across the room, a pen slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the floor. No one moved to retrieve it. One senator closed his notebook slowly, like folding the last page of a funeral program. A reporter's hand hovered over a keyboard, frozen mid-keystroke. Even the cameramen, trained to remain neutral, unshaken, shifted their frames just slightly, instinctively drawn closer to the man at the center of it all. All eyes were on Ted Cruz, and for the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. He didn't reach for the mic. His hand stayed clenched against the lacquered oak of the desk, knuckles white. His jaw was tight, his shoulders didn't move, and, most damning of all, his eyes dropped. They didn't meet hers. They didn't meet anyone's. He stared at the table like it held an exit, like it could somehow erase what had just been said, but nothing could. The camera saw everything, the color draining from his face, the tension pulsing through his temples, the calculated confidence unraveled in front of millions. Because Crockett hadn't made an argument. She hadn't made a political speech. She had made a reckoning. And she made it in his language: bloodlines, borders, birthrights. The very things he used to build his brand were now burning under the weight of their own hypocrisy. And in that moment, surrounded by history, law, and the quiet wrath of a nation's conscience, Ted Cruz sat in silence, not because he chose to, but because truth had already spoken, and he had no words left to stand on. The silence around Cruz wasn't just heavy, it was punishing. The chamber felt frozen in time, suspended in the fallout of a truth too sharp to absorb all at once. Cruz remained seated for a moment longer, motionless, eyes still locked on the grain of the table in front of him. His body was stiff, not from composure, but from the slow, visible collapse of certainty. Whatever line he had prepared, whatever retort was waiting on the tip of his tongue, it died in his throat. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her hands were folded neatly, her expression unreadable. The storm she had summoned now moved on its own. And then, as if pushed by the weight of everything he could no longer defend, Ted Cruz stood. No words, no glance. He adjusted his jacket like armor that no longer fit, then turned and walked out of the chamber. The sound of the door shutting behind him rang louder than any gavel. News of his exit broke before he reached the end of the hallway. Screens across the country lit up, cutting into live coverage with breathless urgency. Crockett silences Cruz with his own family's history, read the first headline on MSNBC. CNN followed moments later: Cruz crumbles under cross-examination of legacy. But it was on social media where the moment exploded into something deeper. The clip of Crockett's final blow, "You are building a wall to stop your own father," was replayed, clipped, translated, and circulated across every platform. On TikTok and Instagram, Spanish-language creators reshared the moment with voiceovers that channeled years of frustration. On YouTube, live streams of the hearing reached view counts typically reserved for presidential debates. By sundown, the most watched video of the day wasn't a political ad. It was a still frame of Cruz, silent, pale, caught in the moment before he stood and walked away. In Latino neighborhoods from San Antonio to Santa Ana, the clip was replayed on phones, televisions, and street corners. Immigrant parents watched it with quiet tears. College students played it in classrooms. It wasn't just a political moment, it was a reckoning. She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for all of us, read the caption beneath one of the most shared posts. And the words resonated because they weren't campaign slogans. They were memory. They were lived experience. And in every version of the story retold that day, one image remained constant: Ted Cruz walking out, not because he lost an argument, but because Jasmine Crockett reminded him of a truth he couldn't afford to answer. The echo of Cruz's silent retreat hadn't yet faded before the impact began to ripple outward, first online, then through neighborhoods, then across the nation like a fault line splitting open underfoot. The video clip of Jasmine Crockett's final blow, her voice firm, her eyes locked, her words searing, didn't spread like gossip. It spread like confession, not political, but personal. In living rooms where immigration wasn't a policy but a story half whispered at dinner tables, the footage played on loop. It didn't need subtitles. It didn't need commentary. It needed only that sentence: "You are building a wall to stop your own father," if he had arrived 60 years too late. And suddenly, something that had been suffocating for years began to breathe again. In homes along the southern border, in apartments where televisions sat next to shrines of family members left behind, immigrant mothers began to go live, not influencers, not activists, just women who had held stories for too long. Their hands trembled as they held up worn photos. Their voices cracked, not from drama, but from memory. One woman, seated in a sunlit kitchen in El Paso, held up a crumpled ICE letter and said into her phone, "This is the day they told me my daughter was too sick to be kept with me. They took her. I never held her again." Another, in a low-income neighborhood in McAllen, stared directly into the lens and whispered, "They called me illegal, but Crockett, she called me human." Her voice broke on that word, human. That was the fight, not for policy, but for recognition. The live streams poured in, quiet, raw, honest. A woman in Tucson showed the scar left by a Border Patrol dog. A grandmother in Bakersfield held up her ankle monitor and wept. And none of it was planned. None of it needed to be. Crockett had ignited something more volatile than outrage, memory, the kind that lives behind silence, the kind that politics never expects to answer. But it wasn't just the mothers. Former Republicans, Latino voters who had once proudly cast their ballots for Cruz, began to post their own videos. Their backgrounds varied: ex-military, small business owners, third-generation Cuban Americans in Florida, farm workers in Arizona who had once believed the system would protect them because they had earned it. One man in Laredo, a Vietnam veteran wearing an American flag ball cap, sat on his porch and said into the camera, eyes red, "We didn't even realize we were immigrants until we heard Crockett say it." Another, standing in a hardware store in San Antonio, looked directly into the lens and said, "I voted for Ted Cruz twice. I defended him at work, on Facebook, in front of my own family. But after hearing her speak, after hearing that, I realized who I really was in his eyes. I wasn't a citizen. I was convenient." The comment sections filled not with arguments, but with apologies, grown men saying, "I didn't see it before," women writing, "I thought it wasn't about people like me." What Cruz had spent years building, an image as both heir to immigrant resilience and defender of hardline policy, began to unravel, not because Crockett exposed a scandal, but because she exposed the truth that lived in the very people he claimed to represent. They weren't invaders. They were him. And for the first time, they saw it clearly. Meanwhile, the senator attempted damage control. Less than 24 hours after the hearing, Cruz appeared on Fox News, seated stiffly beneath a navy backdrop, lit like a man on defense. The cheerin' read, "Cruz responds to heated testimony." His expression was rehearsed, his hands folded tight, but the nerve showed in the tautness of his jaw. "Look," he said to the camera, "this was a performance. Crockett distorted my father's story. She took a proud moment in my family's history and twisted it for headlines." He spoke in polished cadences, sticking to the script, trying to reframe the moment as theater, but it wasn't working. Because Fox News, desperate to give viewers context, cut to a replay of the actual clip. Crockett's voice returned. Her face filled the screen. There was no editing, no dramatic music, no filters, just her eyes, steady as steel, and her voice, "You are building a wall to stop your own father." The anchor didn't speak. The camera cut back to Cruz just in time to catch him swallowing hard, lips pressed into a line. For a few seconds too long, he said nothing. And that silence said everything. The problem wasn't Crockett's performance. The problem was the footage. It didn't distort. It clarified. And no matter how eloquently Cruz tried to wrap himself in patriotism, the contradiction had already been broadcast to millions. The words couldn't be unsaid. The wall couldn't be rebuilt. The moment wasn't just viral, it was transformative. Because in every home where someone had once feared being called illegal, in every store where someone had quietly tucked away their accent, in every family that had learned to whisper instead of weep, Jasmine Crockett had said the one thing no senator ever had. And Cruz had no idea how to answer her, so he left. And now, no one could stop watching. The fury of the hearing had passed, but its shadow lingered. The silence of Ted Cruz as he walked out of the chamber hadn't closed the story. It had merely cracked open something deeper. Jasmine Crockett didn't return home. She didn't take a victory lap. Instead, she boarded a quiet flight to Houston, not for press, not for strategy, but for history. Something about the final moments of that hearing haunted her, not because she had won, but because she had touched something buried, something real. If Cruz had used his father's story to build walls, then Crockett needed to find the place where that story began, before the fences, before the microphones, before the contradictions hardened into policy. She arrived in Houston on a humid afternoon. No motorcade, no press pool, just her and two aides who said little, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a political errand. It was a reckoning. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. The homes were still low and weather-worn, their porches sagging under generations of memory. The same Mexican bakeries, the same peeling church signs, the same fenced-in backyards where Spanish and Creole still echoed through open windows. It was in this very place that Rafael Benito Cruz, a young man fleeing Batista's Cuba, had arrived with a suitcase, a second-hand Bible, and a borrowed name. Crockett stepped into the Centro Esperanza, a modest, faded community center tucked between a laundromat and an aging Pentecostal chapel. Inside, the air was thick with incense and thyme. Folding chairs formed a rough circle. A coffee pot hissed in the corner. On the corkboard hung yellowed bulletins advertising ESL classes, tenants' rights clinics, and prayer vigils for deported sons. She was greeted by a woman named Maria Delgado, tall despite her age, with silver braids pulled tightly down her back and eyes that had seen things no camera ever had. They sat together in silence at first. Maria studied Crockett, not the politician, not the viral clip, but the woman. "You came because of the hearing," Maria finally said, her voice gravelly but measured. "Because of what you said to him." Crockett nodded, but softly. "I came because I needed to know if I was right," she said, "about the kind of man his father was, about what got lost in translation between generations." Maria exhaled and looked toward a faded window where sunlight filtered through dust. "I remember Rafael," she said. "He was no one, just a boy with an accent and eyes too old for his face. But he showed up every Sunday to teach English. Free. Always free. He said it was the only gift he could afford to give." Her voice faltered, then grew stronger. "And when people were scared, when the raids came through here in '63 and they started calling us thieves, he would stand by the church doors and say, 'Learning their language is how we survive. Teaching it is how we stay human.'" Crockett said nothing. Her eyes burned, but she held the silence like a vigil. "He wasn't powerful," Maria added. "But he made people feel like they belonged. He remembered what it meant to arrive with nothing but still give something back." Crockett swallowed hard. The weight of those words settled heavy on her chest. She thought back to the man she'd faced in the chamber just days before, the sharp-suited senator who wrapped his policies in patriotism while denying the very soil his father had once stood on. Then, with hands weathered by decades, Maria reached into her worn leather purse. She didn't say a word as she unfolded a plastic sleeve and carefully handed it to Crockett. The paper inside was a photograph, browned by time, corners curling, but clear enough to make out every face. A young Rafael Cruz, no older than 21, stood beside a hand-painted sign nailed to the side of a wooden shed. The lettering was crooked, the paint chipped, but it was unmistakable. It read, "Welcome Immigrants, 1960. Crockett held the photo in both hands, eyes scanning every detail like scripture. There were other faces in the frame, children, elders, women in aprons. But Raphael stood out, not because he looked powerful, but because he looked present, because he was there. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked at Maria, her voice low and shaking. He opened the door. His son slammed it shut. Maria nodded, the faintest tear glinting in the corner of her eye. "Yes, Mija, that's the truth of it." The room fell silent again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts, full of memory, full of the soft roar of truth too long silenced. Crockett stared again at the sign in the photo, the cracked wood and faded paint, and realized it was more than just a slogan. It was a timestamp, a marker, a proof that there was a moment in America when the son of immigrants stood with open arms before his own son weaponized the gate. As she left the center, the sun had dipped low behind the rooftops, casting long shadows that reached across the pavement like fingers. Crockett didn't speak much on the ride back. She clutched the photo in her lap gently, like it might disappear if she let go. The city blurred by in the windows, but her thoughts stayed anchored in that one room, with that one woman, with that one truth. Rafael Cruz hadn't just survived. He had reached back. He had remembered. He had given. And his son had built a wall. The room had changed. Not in layout, not in decor, but in pressure. The air itself felt denser now, like it was waiting. The chair once occupied by Senator Ted Cruz sat cold and vacant beneath the bright wash of congressional lights, a symbolic silence that said more than any rebuttal ever could. But Jasmine Crockett remained standing, centered at the long mahogany desk, palms resting lightly on her file, the same gray folder she had carried through every moment of this hearing. She had walked through barbed rhetoric, sidestepped slurs, outlasted smirks. Now the tone shifted. The camera zoomed in. This wasn't just rebuttal. This wasn't defense. This was declaration. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was sharpened by something heavier than outrage, memory. And her memory did not flinch. "We've spent hours talking about legality," Crockett began, her voice cutting through the silence like steel under velvet, about sovereignty, about policy, about what some here call preserving the American identity. But before we discuss preservation, we must ask, whose identity are we preserving? She let the question hang. Some senators shifted in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, unmoving, uncomfortable. "When I walked into this chamber, I carried more than documents," she continued. "I carried names, carried stories. I carried the echo of a child's scream behind chain-link fences and the voice of a mother whispering her daughter's name one last time before being separated, possibly forever." Her fingers pressed gently on the gray folder, as if to steady it, or perhaps to keep it closed out of mercy. "But those aren't just anecdotes," she said. "They're evidence. Evidence that we are not afraid of illegality. We are afraid of proximity. We are afraid of being reminded that our roots look a lot more like theirs than we're willing to admit." Now the room had quieted, not just into silence, but into stillness. She leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with no one in particular and with everyone at once. "No one is illegal on stolen land." The sentence didn't land like a punch. It landed like a prophecy. A few staffers scribbled in notebooks, unsure whether to record or redact. Journalists in the back shifted forward instinctively, knowing they had just heard the line that would anchor every headline for the next 48 hours. Jasmine didn't blink. She took one short breath and continued, unwavering. "That sentence may offend some of you. That's fine. Truth tends to bruise when it hits close to bone. But if we are brave enough to face the mirror, if we are honest enough to trace our lineage through the violence that built this country, then we must be brave enough to ask. Are we protecting a nation, or are we protecting a myth?" No answer came, but no answer was necessary. She paused, then drew a single sheet of paper from her folder, not to read it, but to hold it. Its yellowing edges and faded ink told the story before she even spoke. This land has been passed through many hands. And every time someone built a wall to keep others out, history came with a hammer and reminded them, empires rot from the inside, not the outside. She raised the sheet slightly, then slowly laid it flat. "If we do not remember that, we will build monuments to our own cowardice and call them patriotism." One breath, one glance, and then the final blow. "If history had a memory," she said, her voice now a quiet weapon, "it would call every wall we build an apology we were too afraid to speak out loud." That was the last line. But its echo, like the crack of thunder after lightning, rolled through the chamber like an aftershock. No one moved. No one reached for a mic. She stepped back from the table, collected her folder, folded her notes with meticulous care, and then she walked out, not as a politician, not as a Democrat, not even as a woman who had just dismantled a sitting senator's moral argument, but as a witness. A witness to hypocrisy, a witness to history. And for the first time that entire afternoon, even the cameras stopped chasing her. They simply watched her leave. As the final echoes of her words dissolved into the marble of the Capitol, what lingered wasn't applause. It was a silence that felt more like a verdict, carved not by policy, but by memory. There was no gavel loud enough to end what had just happened. No procedural motion that could file it away. When Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the congressional chamber didn't just fall silent. It froze, as if time itself had paused to listen again. The chair tried to move the session forward. Voices murmured, paper shuffled. But everyone knew it was pointless. Something irreversible had been said, not a policy critique, not partisan fire, but a reckoning. A line had been drawn, not in ink, but in truth. And it cut straight through the heart of a system built on forgetting. Within hours, the clip went viral. It didn't need edits. It didn't need music or spin. Just Crockett's voice, steady as steel, saying, "If your father crossed that border today, you'd put him in a cage and call him an invader." That was it. One sentence, and 100 years of immigration hypocrisy collapsed like scaffolding made of lies. Major outlets scrambled to contextualize it. Fox News tried to pivot, calling it a theatrical ambush. MSNBC called it the trial Ted Cruz never saw coming. But it didn't matter what they called it. The people had already decided what it was, a mirror held up to the soul of the country. In the barrios of Houston, the clip played on loop, in bodegas, in barbershops, on cracked phones passed hand to hand. It wasn't just immigrants who watched it. It was their American-born children, finally seeing their stories spoken without apology. A Guatemalan single mother who had lost her asylum case played the clip for her daughter and whispered, "She is what truth looks like when it grows up brave." In a Catholic church in El Paso, the priest opened his sermon by quoting Crockett's final line, "History, if it had memory, would call every wall a confession." No one coughed. No one blinked. Even in God's house, that sentence struck like thunder. But Crockett didn't stay in Washington to bask in the headlines. She flew to Texas, not for press, not for politics, but to sit with families like the ones Cruz had tried to dehumanize. She met a Salvadoran father who had been deported twice and came back because his daughter needed surgery. He cried as he held up a crumpled document with the number 721-0885, the same one Crockett had read aloud in the chamber. She sat down beside him, took his hand, and said, "You're not a number. You're a father, and you were never illegal." That moment didn't make headlines, but it healed something the news couldn't touch. Meanwhile, the blowback came fast and loud. Ted Cruz tried damage control on Fox News, claiming it was all performance, but every time they cut to the clip, it backfired. Viewers weren't seeing a spectacle. They were seeing someone finally call out the double standard that had festered for decades. The right called it emotional blackmail. The left called it long overdue. But none of that mattered to the children still in shelters, still wearing wristbands instead of names. Because for once, someone in Congress wasn't talking about them. She was talking to them. And what she said was simple: you matter, not because a court says so, not because a paper grants you status, but because humanity doesn't begin with documentation. It begins with dignity. Jasmine Crockett didn't win the debate because she had better research. She won because she brought the receipts and the reckoning. She put up Cruz's father's immigration letter like a mirror and then asked the one question that shattered everything: would your family survive your policies? It wasn't rhetorical. It was radioactive. And for once, power had no comeback. Back in D.C., Crockett stood before the press, weary but unwavering. "They'll say this is about me versus Senator Cruz," she told the cameras. "But this is about every child who was called a disease, every mother whose arms were empty because we said national security louder than we said compassion. This is about memory, because when we forget who we were, we become who we fear." That clip, too, went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it said what no one else dared: that laws without love become cages, and fences built on fear will never be enough to keep out the truth. From Miami to Minneapolis, former Republicans began to speak out. One Cuban-born Navy veteran posted, "I voted for Cruz. But that hearing, it broke something in me. My father came here on a raft, and now I have to ask myself, would they call him a threat, too?" Across the border in Tijuana, asylum seekers watched the moment on donated TVs. One teenage boy said, "I don't understand all the words, but I know she was fighting for me." In Washington, congressional aides whispered, "She didn't just debate, she indicted." And what was the lesson? That history is not a trophy, it's a trial. That if we celebrate the journeys of white refugees but jail brown ones, we haven't built a nation, we've built a lie. That a child's tears should weigh more than a campaign check. That the past isn't just prologue, it's precedent. And Crockett, she didn't rewrite the law that day, but she rewrote the story we tell ourselves about who belongs and why. She taught us that borders can be walked, but also questioned, that walls don't just keep people out, they keep truth in. And perhaps most painfully of all, she showed that the American dream isn't dead, it's just been taken hostage by those who forgot their own origin stories. The question isn't who deserves to be here. The question is, who are we when we forget how we got here? And in answering that, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend the voiceless. She reminded the powerful that silence is no longer an option, not in this chamber, not in this country, not anymore. When Crockett's voice finally left the air, raw, deliberate, etched in every camera lens, it didn't die in the room. It moved like voltage through a national wound. What began as a confrontation with one man had become something far bigger, a reckoning, crashing into every place where silence had been sold as safety. At a battered community center in El Paso, mothers huddled around a second-hand TV, watching the full recording play again. Some clutched rosaries. One held a missing persons file. The moment Crockett lifted the numbered wristband and said, "In your system, she has no name," a gasp broke the room's breath. One woman whispered, "She's talking about my daughter." Another stood up, trembling, and cried, "No one ever said it out loud before." The silence that followed wasn't grief. It was a spark. In Houston, just blocks from the apartment Rafael Cruz once called home, a high school auditorium turned into a town hall without warning. Crockett's speech had reached immigrant families like a siren in a locked tunnel. Fathers who worked triple shifts showed up in grease-stained uniforms. Daughters who once felt embarrassed to translate for their parents now stood proud behind microphones. "Congresswoman Crockett didn't speak for us," said one teenage boy. "She made space so we could speak for ourselves." The applause didn't come in waves. It came like thunder that had been held back too long. Meanwhile, right-wing pundits scrambled for a response. On Fox News, Cruz called the hearing a political circus, claiming Crockett weaponized family history to distract from real border threats. But every time the clip aired, it backfired. His face, frozen in close-up silence, became the image of a man cornered not by politics, but by truth. The phrase, "Mr. Cruz, would you cage your own father if he arrived 60 years late," trended for 3 days straight. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a national mirror. Columbia University immigration law students used Crockett's confrontation as a case study. One professor declared, "Forget hypotheticals. This is what legal accountability looks like when it speaks in plain English." Students transcribed her words into multiple languages, Spanish, Arabic, Urdu, and distributed them to nonprofit clinics working with asylum seekers. One young lawyer printed the phrase, "Policy doesn't die, children do," and taped it above every intake desk in their detention support office. In suburban Arizona, a retired Republican and Korean War veteran sat with his granddaughter, tears sliding beneath his oxygen tube. "I voted for that man," he said, pointing to Cruz. "But that woman, she reminded me of the nun who saved my mother in 1950. She didn't care what country we came from, just that we were human." His granddaughter posted a photo of him saluting the screen, and by morning, it had reached 1 million views, captioned only, "He changed his mind." Churches joined. A Lutheran pastor in Omaha rewrote Sunday's sermon around Crockett's final words: "If history had memory, it would call every wall an apology to the past." Her congregation, many of them first generation, wept. One left a note on the offering plate: "I always thought God forgot us." Maybe he was waiting for her. But the story didn't stop with emotion. In Washington, 4 senators, 2 Democrats, 2 independents, co-sponsored a new transparency bill requiring financial disclosure for all detention center contractors. The bill was nicknamed the Crockett Clause. Its mission was surgical: to sever profit from human suffering. Lobbyists pushed back, of course, but they no longer controlled the narrative. Every committee room they entered now had a screen. Every screen had Crockett's face holding a letter from 1957. At the same time, a collective of formerly detained children, now young adults, launched a movement called 721-0885, named after the wristband Crockett had held aloft. Their slogan: "We remember each other." Their first act: building a digital archive where families could search detention codes, find lost siblings, and upload childhood memories erased by bureaucracy. Their second act: filing a class action lawsuit against 2 for-profit prison contractors tied to the Cruz campaign. Even public school students responded. In Oakland, 7th graders drew portraits of children in cages, but instead of bars, they used flags. "The flags," one girl explained, "are the things adults hide behind." Their teacher uploaded the art to a digital gallery titled, "We Have Names." Within days, schools in Minneapolis, Miami, and Dallas had joined in. Students didn't just want to learn history anymore. They wanted to challenge it. And it wasn't just the left. Former Republican staffers began penning op-eds, not to defend Crockett, but to reckon with her. One powerful quote surfaced from a Cuban-American activist in Tampa: "We didn't realize we were immigrants until we heard Crockett say it. We just thought we were lucky, but luck isn't justice." That line found its way onto t-shirts, murals, and even protest signs held by grandmothers in Florida, arms shaking but eyes on fire. Yet, for every act of awareness, there was resistance. Cruz supporters staged a counter-campaign online, accusing Crockett of emotional blackmail and weaponizing race. But even their hashtags couldn't drown out the image: Rafael Cruz in 1960, standing beneath a banner that read, "Welcome immigrants," held next to his son's face, stone-cold before a question he couldn't answer. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett never posted a single tweet. She didn't take a victory lap. She didn't need to, because her words had already entered the bloodstream of a wounded nation. Not as policy, but as challenge. If laws pay dividends to your donors, you're not a lawmaker. You're a shareholder. Policy doesn't die, children do. No one is illegal on stolen land. People wrote those lines on chalkboards, painted them on alley walls, whispered them at vigils. One pastor in New Mexico recited Crockett's full closing statement, eyes closed, hand over heart, and then added, "May our nation someday be worthy of these words." In the months that followed, Crockett's congressional office was flooded with 14,000 letters, many from undocumented children. One simply said, "You gave us a name." And perhaps that was the point all along. This wasn't just about Ted Cruz or even about a broken immigration system. It was about the power of remembering out loud, about a woman daring to say, "Your father was once the man you now call a threat," about drawing the line between history and hypocrisy, about turning silence into testimony, pain into blueprint, shame into accountability. Because Crockett didn't just ask for justice. She forced the room to choose, between comfort and truth, between the past we hide and the future we pretend we're building. And now, across churches and schools, borders and boardrooms, the question that once fell flat in Congress now echoed in every ear: what kind of nation cages the man who gave you your last name just because he arrived 60 years too late? The answer wasn't in Cruz's silence. It was in what the people did next. And just when the national momentum seemed to settle into reflection, something unexpected happened. The children began to speak, not through elected officials, not through advocacy groups, but in their own trembling voices. In San Antonio, a 10-year-old girl named Lucia stood before her classroom with her wrist marked in pen, 721-0885. "This was my cousin's number," she said. "Now it's her name in heaven." Her teacher broke down in tears. At a rally days later, Lucia stood beside Jasmine Crockett, who handed her the microphone and stepped back. "My family is not scary," the child said. "We are not a virus. We are a story still being written." The crowd didn't cheer. They cried, because they knew what it meant when a child had to remind a country of its own humanity. In New York, a Broadway actor paused mid-performance, broke character, and quoted Crockett's speech. The audience rose. In L.A., muralists painted Rafael Cruz beside Jacqueline Cale, linked not by politics, but by the fragility of a rival. In Miami, a Cuban-American cafe renamed its house blend Bienvenido Brew, with proceeds going to refugee education. None of it was coordinated. No foundation, no campaign, just a ripple born from truth, from a hearing no one thought would matter. And Jasmine, she never changed her posture, never claimed a movement. She returned to work, same office, same fire in her voice, knowing full well the hearing had only opened a wound that needed generations to heal. But in the faces of Lucia, the murals, the headlines, the trembling old vets, and the wide-eyed teens, one thing was now unmistakable: the story wasn't hers anymore. It was America's. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.